Okay, so this is Chapter 5 audio, measurement. Okay, so in this chapter, the chapter is really talking about the measurement process itself. So how you can go from conceptualizing to actually operationalizing your variables, right? So conceptualizing, trying to, develop the theoretical underpinnings of how relationships are established versus operationalizing, making sure you're measuring what you think you're measuring. So we'll go through all that. Also, we're going to talk about different types and selection of operational definitions, the different levels of measurement, because I know you're excited to hear about that. And then, of course, reliability and validity, how you assess them, both reliability and validity, the importance of them, and all that fun stuff. So anyway, jumping into it, what is measurement? So measurement is the process of assigning numbers or labels to represent conceptual properties. So if you've rated something on Netflix, or if you've been weighed at the doctor's office, then you've experienced measurement. So we're going to talk about the importance of specifying what the labels are, like what they're for, basically, making sure that they're for what is being measured. So you're looking at how they're being measured, what is being measured, what the unit of analysis is to be measured. So it's essential in making research replicable. If you understand how someone conceptualized or operationalized and how they actually measured when they created their data, then you can see whether their findings are valid, reliable, or both. So defining generally follows the deductive model of inquiry, moving from the abstract concepts to specific, more concrete ways of observing them. So looking at the figure from your book, which can be helpful if you're a visual learner, basically, I'm going to review this here, but we're going to get into each step individually in a minute. Measurement is all about assigning numbers or labels to units of analysis so that you can represent their conceptual properties. So in the figure, the first two steps are called conceptualization, where the purpose is to clarify the meaning of the concepts that you're going to study or be under analysis in your research. So in your literature, you're going to find multiple definitions, but you need to choose those concepts or definitions that fit the theoretical framework of your research. And the next two steps are called operationalization. So this involves making specific what was that more theoretical in the conceptualization. So in the case of measurement on Netflix, you need to know if the scale is at a 4 stars or 5 stars, for example. You have to have a way to specifically measure the variable you identified in the conceptualization stage. Then you're actually going to collect the data and check to make sure it's reliable and valid. So again, we're going to go in depth, step by step, into all of that. All right, so with conceptualization, the objective is to clarify the meanings of concepts that are embedded in the research question. So with words or examples, you're going to clarify what it is that you're looking at conceptually and theoretically. So this clarification may occur by defining the theoretical meanings of the concept, by distinguishing the concept from similar concepts, and by identifying different dimensions of the concepts you're using. So of course, this is based on the lit review. You're going to conduct a literature review to find out what previous research studies have found about your particular variables or your particular theoretical approach. And as a result, this is going to help you structure your own research study. So in the book, they talk about conceptualization in BROH'S research as she defined what her variables were. So, she had to explain what is academic achievement also, and, what was extracurricular activities. So when it came to these extraneous or intervening variables, she also defined what social capital was in relation to her specific research study. So here you have the table explaining how she talked about social capital versus human capital, tailoring it to her own research studies specifics. All right, and then when it comes to operationalization, the objective is to identify ways of observing variation in the concept. So the book uses the old idiom, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, it's probably a duck, right? So this is related to, step 1 in the 2 steps of operationalization. Step 1 is identify empirical indicators of a concept. So in the duck scenario, How do you know something's a duck? The walk and the quack are pretty good indicators, right? So in research, we look for empirical indicators, which are characteristics that are related to the concept you're examining, or really just knowing a duck makes a quacking noise, and that noise can then identify it or differentiate it from others. So this may be based on conceptual dimensions, but also multiple indicators are preferable to a single indicator. So there might be other birds that make similar noises, right, or walk in similar ways, or have similar migratory patterns. So if you're relying on a sole indicator, it might not be effective enough at differentiating the variable being examined from other similar concepts or variables, in this case, ducks, right? So in the second step, you have to spell out the procedures for applying indicators in collecting your data. So this is where it gets even more specific. You're going to spell out your specific procedures that you're going to use to look at the relationships related to your empirical indicators in your research. So you're operationalizing and providing clear details so that others can look at your study and know enough about the procedures to determine its credibility. And of course, so that other researchers could replicate the research in future studies and then have insight into your measurement and explanation parameters of each variable. So BROH'S designed, academic achievement was in her research, she looked at that variable as scores within an English course, right? But it could have been SAT scores, it could have been GPA, or something else if she would have designed it that way, right? So part of step 2 also consists of indicators plus procedures. So the book has a great analogy of the indicators and procedures needed in research as those needed to make a carrot cake. So you need to know the ingredients with shared definitions such as eggs, whole milk, etc., and the procedures or directions as to how to put it together, like how to bake it, let it cool, for what period of time, at what temperature. It's similar with research. You need to leave a sort of recipe in your research to others so that they can assess what you have made and try to replicate it themselves. So in BROH'S research, she identified 4 types of social ties in her examination of the previous literature. And of course, in relation to her specific research questions. So she argued that social capital of students is grounded in 4 types of relationships: the parent-child relationship, parent-teacher relationship, student-teacher relationship, and student-student relationship. So by identifying these specific relationships, she could make precise statements of her hypothesis that is then connected to the data clearly. So when you go through conceptualization to operationalization, you solidify from concepts that you're looking at to specific measurable variables, right? So looking at these relationships of social capital. Did the teacher talk to the student a lot more outside of class, right? That's kind of her indicator of a type of social capital within that way. So instead of social capital being a concept, she can literally measure it by saying, well, did they talk to their teacher or not? That would be the way to measure it. Okay, so just like in cooking, there's a lot of different kinds of foods and dishes. In research, there's many possible operational definitions for many variables. So there's 2 general kinds of operational definitions in social research. There's manipulation operations and measured operations. So manipulation operations involves changing categories or variables of a variable. And this usually applies to independent variables in experiments. Versus in measured operations, this is when you estimate existing values of categories. So when you look at the sources of measured operations, the first, basically in measured observations, since you're estimating existing values, you want some way to make sure that this person is, to validate basically what they're saying. So verbal self-reports is a good one because they're based on answers to questions, which is by far the most common form of social measurement. So most of the variables in BROH'S research in the book actually came from verbal or self-reports. So sometimes these reports include visual diagrams or pictures, And as mentioned before, it's best to use several indicators to measure complex concepts to make sure that you're getting at all aspects of it and that it's reliable and valid. So observation is another source of measured operations. Direct observation of behavior, or really just use of technology to record behavior, is common in field research, because then you can match what people say with what they actually do, right? Examine their patterns of interaction. And then later you can ask for clarification of the meanings of the relationships or the patterns that you're seeing. So while, it's there to see what has happened as an overt behavior, it can also be used to get at people's experiences, such as their feelings and attitudes. Like, when she's studying school environments, to ask someone, what did it feel like to be bullied in that situation? Being able to watch the account, go back and ask the person to clarify what their experiences were, kind of gives you a more depth of understanding. And then the third source of measured operations is archival records. So the use of existing recorded information is a good one. And there's various and diverse sources of these kinds of data. So it could be statistical records, public documents, private documents, the media itself in various forms, right? So if you're doing this kind of research, you need to pick your concepts and then define the specific ways they're going to, be looked at, define the parameters of these, and how you're going to measure them. So how is it that you select operational definitions? Well, this depends on the approach, obviously. If you're using an experiment, a survey, if you're using qualitative research, existing data analysis. So like with everything else, your research question is what pushes your research in one direction to a specific research design. So let's say you picked a survey approach. Those rely mostly on self-reports or verbal reports to a researcher. So again, the approach you pick depends on your question, as your method is trying to basically answer that question. So you need to create an operational definition that fits the conceptual definition. So this just means you need to use the theory in which the concept is embedded as a guide for your research. So if you understand the meaning of the concept in relation to the theory, you're going to have the best possible fit between the concept and the measurement of that concept. So levels of measurement indicate the conclusions that may be drawn when comparing units to one another. So each level has the qualities of the level below it plus some other qualities. So first you have nominal. So nominal, you merely use labels as variable categories. So a clear example of nominal measurement that, or at least one that pops up in my own research, would be your political party affiliation. So there's no numerical representation of this. So the name itself explains a category under examination. So there's no mathematical relationships in nominal measurement. You would simply set a category to a number when you got to the statistical analysis, which they talk about on page 117 of the chapter, if you need more clarification on that. But basically, the point of a nominal measurement is to indicate whether two cases are the same or different. And so that means categories should be exhaustive and mutually exclusive. So you want them to be different enough that people are one or the other for clarification purposes. So instead of saying, are you liberal or conservative, you would say, are you a Democrat? Are you Green Party, Peace and Freedom Party, Republican Party, Libertarian Party, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Because if you say liberal conservative, people could be liberal, Republicans, or they could be conservative Democrats. So it doesn't really measure it in that same kind of specific way. A nominal measurement makes them pretty mutually exclusive. So then ordinal measurement is basically when you use numbers to indicate some sort of rank order on a variable. So in this case, numbers are assigned, but again, they don't represent value. They represent the order of the categories. So it's like if I asked you, what are your 3 favorite bands? The numbers are not related to the specific value, but the order in which you prefer them, right? So then interval is a little bit different. Interval basically there's numbers that indicate the distance between cases. So it has the qualities of nominal and ordinal levels, but it also means that there are specified distances in the variable being measured. So temperature could be an example of this. Saying that it's 90 degrees, there's a specific difference between 95 degrees and 90 degrees. So it is an interval measure, example of an interval measure. And ratio, the difference with ratio is that it has an absolute 0 point, so that different numbers may form a ratio, hence calling it ratio, right? So this makes it easier to remember in comparison to the others. These variables have an absolute 0, so your age could be a ratio. Your income could be a ratio. These kind of examples of this. Okay, so this figure shows how the 4 levels of measurement provide different forms of information. So based on the variables you're looking at in your research, their type can help you determine what kind of statistical measures you could use to measure them. In a lot of ways, interval and ratio are often lumped together as they're more closely related, especially in comparison to nominal and ordinal. All right, so when it comes to reliability and validity, in doing research, it's not enough to plan it and do it. We have to make sure what we find is actually reliable and valid so that we can add our findings to the body of research that came before it. So what is reliability? Reliability is the stability or consistency of an operational definition. So is the operational definition measuring something consistently? Is it measuring it dependently? And if you use the same conditions again, are you going to get the same results? Right? That's what they're looking for there. When you're looking at how to understand this, you have to measure reliability and validity. So measurement validity is the goodness of fit between an operational definition and the concept that it's intended to measure. So does your operational definition really reflect what the concept means? Are you measuring what you intended to measure with your operational definition, right? That's what you should be thinking about at that point. So what is the relationship between these two, between reliability and validity? Well, it's important that your research variables be both reliable and valid. Validity is a bit more critical because it's wrong or inaccurate without the validity. So that's kind of like it needs to be valid. But a reliable measure may or may not be valid. So let's say you have a thermometer on your patio, right? And it's off by 10 degrees. It says it's 10 degrees cooler than it is. It would not be valid as a representation of the actual temperature, but it is reliable in the fact that it's always 10 degrees off, right? So an unreliable measure, though, cannot be valid. So as if a measure is unreliable, it may be measuring the wrong thing, right? It may be consistently measuring the wrong thing, such as, again, inaccurately or incorrectly measuring the temperature by saying that it's 10 degrees cooler or 10 degrees hotter than it is. So you need these things to be both in order to make sure that your research is actually valid, but it is possible to have reliability without validity. So this actually will make a little more sense of that. This target analogy, I feel like, is very helpful in explaining the difference between these concepts of reliability and validity. So the first target shows low reliability and low validity. So the scores are not consistently grouped in one area, and they're not near the bullseye target. The second target shows high reliability and low validity. So you see a bunch of them grouped in one spot, but it's not in the center of the bullseye, which is obviously the goal. So when you have a high reliability, it means you're going to hit the same spot each time, but not the validity of accurately hitting the center of the bullseye. And the third one shows the goal of research, obviously, good validity and good reliability, where you hit the accurate center of the target and all of the shots are pretty much clustered in the same place reliably. So researchers have ways to assess reliability. One is the test-retest measure. So this measures the same units or persons on 2 separate occasions. So for a correlation to be considered reliable, it has to have at least a 0.8 on a scale of 0 to 1. So it's often impractical, though, the test-retest method, and the results may be unclear. So the example they talk about in the chapter is the self-esteem scores. And the table 5.3 at the top over here shows a test-retest data slice that can give an idea of how reliable a measure is, as it should be pretty much the same score each time if it is reliable. So you see the person number 3, person number 5 have the same score each time, but some of these other people varied a lot. Let's see here. Okay, so then with internal consistency, this measures the consistency of scores across a set of items. So this applies only to composite measures, meaning indexes and scales and stuff like that. So like the test-retest estimate, internal consistency estimates yield coefficients that run from, again, 0 to 1. So most people, when they think of internal consistency, think of Cronbach's alpha. So that's a common estimate of internal consistency, which, if you've taken stats, you've probably had to click the little button on SPSS to do it. This is based on the average of the correlations among the responses to all possible pairs of items. So for the info in table 5.4 over here, where they measured the internal consistency, they used Cronbach's alpha, and it was 0.94, which, remember, is in a scale of 0 to 1, so that is reliable. So a third measure of reliability is inter-rater, or sometimes called intercoder reliability, which measures consistency across different observers or coders. So the assumption is that no matter who applies an operational definition, they're going to get the same scores or values. So this applies when observers are coding behavior, or when raters or coders are looking at coding documents, like a existing data analysis, like a content analysis or something like that. So if I asked you to find images of Asian Americans in children's television, then anyone doing that content analysis should come up with roughly the same number of representations in a specified media. Like if I said in PBS Kids, or maybe Nickelodeon, right? So people doing this kind of research need to have an agreement on about 85% level for these variables to be considered reliable when it comes to what is an Asian American representation, right? So even when you're talking about coding existing data, you need to have some way to make sure that you're actually reliably finding the correct data. All right, so validity also needs to be assessed. So how can you assess validity? Well, the researcher's concerned with what's being measured, right? With the theoretical meanings of a concept, and whether a given operational definition actually represents the meanings that the researcher's trying to observe. So, and not just be seeing something else. So there's really two ways to do it. The first is convergent validation. So this really is trying to determine the extent to which an independent measure of the same concepts is associated. So if everyone in the class based their own survey that they have to make later on the self-esteem scale that they talk about in the chapter, then their findings should be similar. Like my Cretney scale versus the enter your name here scale, right? They should all be looking at self-esteem. They should have similar findings and relationships to one another as they're measuring similar things. So you can enhance convergent validation by using multiple alternative measures, and by using measures based on different operational methods. So observations and self-reports, right? Like writing a journal, having the respondents write a journal, and then interviewing them to see if the information converges with what they said in the journal to have similar findings. And then there's construct validation, which is where you determine the extent to which an operational definition is related to other variables as theoretically expected. So this is based on an accumulation of research evidence. There's not really a single association that they're looking for here. This is really involves checking relationships with theoretically related and unrelated variables. So under construct validation, they're looking at how the meaning of any scientific concept is implied by its theoretical relationship to other concepts. So really, just to make sure the relationship is valid, you need to make sure the underlying theory that suggests a relationship itself is valid. And lastly, there's this feedback loop situation within measurement where Measurement in quantitative research proceeds from concept to measures and data. We talked about this a whole bunch, the kind of deductive approach, right? So you look at the previous theory in research and you develop a hypothesis. You then test the relationship between those variables after you collect the data, right? But this goes the other way too, with measurement in qualitative research proceeding from observations or data to concepts, where, in the inductive approach, you're getting the data that you need, and then to understand it, you're using the existing theory. So this means analysis may be used to refine operational definitions. So, we have to factor analysis. We have to look at these ways to identify conceptual dimensions of what we think we're identifying. So we have to probe with in-depth interviews to explore what questions meant to respond in. So you can refine these operational definitions of questions by just asking people, again, either through different methods, through different observable ways, just to try and get at the meanings, right? That to make sure that you've operationalized correctly, that the question is measuring what the researcher thinks it's measuring, right? So by asking the respondent what they think it's measuring in different ways, then you're going to get a better understanding of what it is actually measuring and not just what the researcher thinks it's measuring, right? So in this way, you can actually, again, check yourself to make all of these things to make sure your operational definitions are much more valid.